There was no gunshot. No shouting. No one running. Just a small room, lit by fluorescent lights so white they seemed to drain depth from everything inside. On the table lay a thin stack of papers, neatly clipped, aligned with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. The man sitting across the table had signed his name thousands of times before. On invoices. On contracts. On bank forms. On documents he rarely read all the way through. His signature was smooth, practiced, automatic, a motion his hand could perform without asking his brain for permission. But this time, it felt different. The pen weighed more than it should have. Not because of its material, but because of the silence in the room. No one rushed him. No one threatened him. No one promised him anything. There was only a sentence, spoken slowly, evenly. You just need to sign here. No one explained what here meant. No one said what would follow. He looked down at the page. Legal language. Long sentences. Nested clauses. Words designed to be precise, not understood. Everything looked official. Legitimate. Ordinary. There was a brief moment, so short it barely existed, when he considered asking a question. Just one. But the thought dissolved before it could fully form. Because in his mind, this wasn't a decision. It was a formality. He didn't sign out of greed. He didn't sign out of fear. He didn't sign because someone forced him. He signed because he saw no reason not to. His wrist moved. Ink met paper. A familiar curve appeared on the page. Nothing in the room reacted. No sound marked the moment. No clock stopped ticking. No light flickered. But somewhere else, not in that room, a sequence of consequences had just been set in motion. Years later, people would try to trace everything back to the mistake. They would search for the dramatic choice, the reckless move, the obvious wrongdoing. They would point to later decisions, louder moments, clearer risks. No one would mention this signature. No one would call it the point of no return. No one would describe it as a turning point. Because on the surface, it destroyed nothing. It didn't take money right away. It didn't cost him his job. It didn't put him in handcuffs. It left only a mark. A signature. A trace of ink. Something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. And if you stay until the end of this story, you'll understand why. Some tragedies don't begin with bad intentions. They begin with things no one thinks to question. Before anyone knew his name, before documents would reduce him to case numbers and headlines, he was simply a man living a life that felt unremarkable, and that was precisely how he wanted it. He was in his late 30s. Not young enough to believe everything would work out on its own, not old enough to feel finished with the future. He worked a mid-level professional job that required reliability more than brilliance. His title sounded respectable in conversation, vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. He earned enough to live without constant anxiety, but not enough to feel insulated from risk. His income arrived on time every month. Rent was paid. Utilities were automated. Groceries followed a routine. He knew which aisles to walk through without thinking. His life had rhythm, not exciting, but stable. He lived alone in a modest apartment in a city that rarely made headlines. Not a place people dreamed of moving to, but a place people ended up staying. The kind of city where ambition softened over time, where most residents learned to measure success by absence of trouble rather than presence of achievement. His apartment reflected that mindset. Clean, functional, slightly impersonal. Furniture chosen for durability, not style. Neutral colors. Nothing broken, nothing upgraded. The walls held no art except a framed certificate from years ago, a credential that had once mattered deeply and now mostly served as proof that he had once believed in momentum. He wasn't lonely, but he wasn't deeply connected either. His family lived several hours away. They spoke on the phone regularly, though the conversations rarely went deep. Updates were exchanged like inventory lists. Work was fine, health was fine, nothing new to report. There was affection, but it was careful, contained, never dramatic. He had friends, or at least people who filled that role. Coworkers he drank with occasionally. Old acquaintances he messaged on birthdays. Relationships that required little emotional maintenance. If someone moved away, the connection faded naturally, without conflict. There had been relationships. A few long ones. None that ended explosively. Mostly mutual realizations that something fundamental was missing. He was often described as reliable, steady, easy to be with. Rarely as intense or passionate. Those words followed him in every area of life. At work, he was dependable. He showed up on time. He followed procedures. He didn't challenge authority unless it was clearly safe to do so. Managers trusted him with responsibility because he didn't surprise them. Colleagues came to him when they needed something done correctly, not creatively. He was not invisible, but he was not memorable either. And that was not an accident. Earlier in his career, he had learned, slowly, through observation rather than instruction, that visibility carried risk. The people who stood out were the ones blamed when something went wrong. The ones who pushed back were remembered. The ones who asked too many questions developed reputations. So he learned to stay within the acceptable range. He read policies carefully enough to comply, but not enough to interrogate them. He followed processes without asking why they existed. He trusted that someone else, someone higher up, someone smarter, someone paid to worry, had already thought things through. This wasn't laziness. It was adaptation. His job required him to handle paperwork, approvals, records. He dealt with documents every day, forms that passed through multiple hands, accumulating signatures like sediment. His role was often one step in a long chain, never the final authority, never the origin. That structure gave him comfort. When responsibility was distributed, guilt became abstract. Decisions belonged to systems, not individuals. If something failed, it failed collectively. He told himself this often, though he never said it out loud. Outside of work, his ambitions were modest. He wanted financial stability. Maybe a slightly larger apartment someday. Maybe a relationship that lasted. He imagined retirement not as freedom, but as relief, the absence of pressure rather than the presence of joy. He didn't dream big, but he dreamed safe. And for a long time, that seemed like wisdom. He avoided debt where possible. He avoided conflict whenever it appeared unnecessary. He avoided choices that would force him to explain himself. His life strategy was simple: minimize exposure. There were moments, though small ones, when doubt crept in. Occasionally, late at night, he would feel a vague dissatisfaction he couldn't articulate. Not regret, exactly. More like a sense that something important was happening elsewhere, to other people. That life was a series of rooms he had chosen not to enter. But those thoughts were fleeting. They dissolved in routine. Morning alarms. Work emails. Grocery lists. He reminded himself that most disasters came from wanting too much. What he never fully acknowledged was that his life depended heavily on systems he did not control and barely understood. The company he worked for had layers of management, compliance departments, legal oversight. Policies changed frequently. New training modules appeared without explanation. Everyone adapted. No one asked why. There were rumors, occasionally, about investigations, about restructures, about someone being let go. They circulated briefly, then vanished. Officially, everything was always fine. And he believed that. Because believing otherwise would require effort. At no point did he consider himself naive. He thought of himself as realistic, cautious, mature. The kind of person who understood how the world actually worked. He knew that rules existed for a reason. That organizations protected themselves. That individual workers were replaceable. He accepted all of this as neutral fact, not injustice. So when responsibilities expanded slowly over time, he accepted them. When new forms crossed his desk, he processed them. When asked to step in temporarily, he did. Each addition felt minor. Reasonable. Incremental. Nothing ever felt like a leap. And that was the most important detail. There was no dramatic before and after version of him. No sudden shift in values. No hidden darkness waiting to surface. He did not wake up one day as a different person. He was the same man he had always been, careful, cooperative, unremarkable. The kind of person systems depend on. The kind of person systems rarely protect. Looking back, it would be tempting to search for warning signs. To identify moments where he should have known better. To label his caution as weakness, his compliance as cowardice. But at the time, nothing stood out. His life made sense to him. It was orderly, predictable, legible, and most importantly, it felt safe. Which is why, when an opportunity later presented itself, something framed not as risk, but as reassurance, it didn't trigger alarm. It felt like continuity. Like the next reasonable step. And that is what made it dangerous. To understand what happened later, it's necessary to step back from the man himself and look at the environment that shaped him, not as a villain, not as a conspiracy, but as a structure that rewarded certain behaviors and quietly punished others. The system around him did not announce itself. It didn't feel oppressive. There were no guards, no locked doors, no explicit threats. Instead, it presented itself as order. Rules. Procedures. Compliance. Everything had a process, and every process had a document explaining it. The language was neutral, technical, unemotional. It spoke in terms of efficiency, liability, risk mitigation. Words that sounded responsible. Adult. At his workplace, authority was diffuse. No single person appeared to be fully in charge, and that was by design. Decisions were broken into parts. Responsibility was shared across departments. When something went wrong, it was rarely clear where the fault actually lay. This diffusion created a specific kind of safety, not moral safety, but psychological safety. If no one fully owns a decision, no one fully bears the consequences. He learned this not through training, but through observation. When mistakes happened, they were framed as process failures. When harm occurred, it was unfortunate but within acceptable parameters. When people were removed, it was described as organizational restructuring. Language did the work that accountability did not. There were rules about everything, but enforcement was selective. Minor violations were ignored if they kept operations moving. Major violations were only acknowledged when they became visible to outsiders. Internally, the priority was continuity. Keep things running. Avoid attention. Document everything. The system valued documentation above truth. As long as a form was filled correctly, as long as the boxes were checked, the underlying reality mattered less. A problem that existed on paper could be managed. A problem that existed in reality but not on paper was invisible. This shaped behavior. People learned to protect themselves not by questioning outcomes, but by following procedures exactly. Deviating from protocol, even with good intentions, was dangerous. It created traceable liability. Compliance, on the other hand, offered cover. If you followed the steps, you were safe. If you asked questions, you were exposed. This was never stated explicitly. It didn't need to be. Everyone understood it intuitively. He saw colleagues who raised concerns labeled as difficult. Not fired immediately, but sidelined. Excluded from key conversations. Passed over quietly. Their careers didn't end, they just stopped progressing. No one said it was punishment. Everyone understood it was. At the same time, there was an unspoken expectation of flexibility. Deadlines still had to be met. Targets still mattered. When rules conflicted with results, results usually won, as long as the paperwork looked correct afterward. This created a gray zone where everyone operated. Officially, nothing improper happened. Unofficially, everyone knew adjustments were being made. The system depended on people who could navigate this ambiguity without drawing attention to it. People like him. He was not powerful. He did not design policies. He did not benefit significantly from bending rules. But he was useful. He understood how things worked in practice, not just in theory. He knew which steps mattered and which were ceremonial. Which signatures were scrutinized and which were routine. Which actions created risk and which disappeared into the background noise. This knowledge made him valuable and vulnerable. Because the system did not reward loyalty with protection. It rewarded utility with proximity. Those closest to the machinery absorbed the most risk. Outside the organization, broader societal forces reinforced the same logic. There was a cultural expectation of trust in institutions. Forms existed for a reason. Experts were assumed to know better. Questioning procedures was often framed as paranoia or incompetence. People like him were praised for being professional, for not making waves, for understanding how things work. The legal framework supported this posture. Responsibility flowed downward. Authority flowed upward. When disputes arose, documentation mattered more than context. Intent mattered less than signatures. A name on a page carried weight that no explanation could easily undo. There were also economic pressures. Job mobility was limited. Positions like his were replaceable in theory but risky to leave in practice. Benefits, stability, seniority, these tied people to their roles. Walking away was framed as irresponsibility. Staying was framed as maturity. Over time, the system trained its participants to think in narrow time horizons. Today's task. This quarter's performance. This audit cycle. Long-term consequences were abstract, someone else's problem. And because nothing catastrophic happened immediately, this approach seemed validated. Small compromises didn't feel like compromises. They felt like realism. He did not feel trapped. That's important. He felt embedded. Supported. Structured. Protected. The irony was that the very mechanisms that created this sense of safety were the same ones that would later isolate him completely. Because when systems fail publicly, they look for clean lines of responsibility. Someone whose name appears clearly. Someone whose actions can be documented. The system itself does not appear in court. Processes are not charged. Culture is not sentenced. Individuals are. At this stage, none of that was visible to him. From inside the structure, everything appeared logical. Rational. Defensible. There were no villains. No secret meetings. No explicit wrongdoing. Just incentives aligned in a way that made certain outcomes more likely, and certain people expendable. He was not singled out. He was positioned. And when the moment came that looked like an opportunity, something framed as a solution, not a threat, it emerged naturally from this environment. Not as a rupture, but as a continuation. The opportunity did not arrive as an interruption. It arrived as an accommodation. There was no dramatic meeting. No urgent summons. No language that suggested danger. It came wrapped in reassurance, framed as support rather than change. A problem had emerged, not a crisis, not officially. More like an inefficiency. A backlog. Something that needed to be handled temporarily, while higher levels sorted things out. This was how such things were always introduced. He was approached because he was known to be reliable. Because he understood the paperwork. Because he didn't panic. Because he didn't ask questions that slowed things down. The request was presented as narrow in scope. Just for now. Just to help. Just until things stabilize. It was not described as an expansion of responsibility. It was described as a shield, a way to prevent issues from escalating. A way to protect the organization. And by extension, the people inside it. Including him. There was a subtle appeal to competence. To trust. To professionalism. They didn't say, we need someone to absorb this risk. They said, we need someone who understands the process. They didn't say, this could come back to you. They said, this keeps things clean. The task itself was not complicated. It involved oversight. Verification. Signing off on documents that had already passed through other hands. His role was framed as confirmatory, not decisive. He was not being asked to create anything new, only to validate what already existed. That distinction mattered to him. He asked a few questions, practical ones. About timelines. About reporting structure. About whether this was temporary. The answers were smooth. Reasonable. Vague in the way that organizational answers often are. Yes, temporary. Yes, covered. Yes, approved at higher levels. There was no explicit lie. Just an absence of specificity. And there was something else, something unspoken but clearly felt. Declining was an option. But not a neutral one. Saying no would have required explanation. It would have marked him as uncooperative. Not defiant, just inconvenient. The kind of inconvenience that gets remembered. Accepting, on the other hand, cost him nothing immediately. No pay cut. No added hours, officially. No change in title. It even came with subtle validation. A nod of recognition. A sense of being trusted. In systems like this, trust is currency. He told himself this wasn't ambition. He wasn't trying to climb. He wasn't angling for promotion. He was simply being helpful. Responsible. And that framing allowed him to ignore the small discomfort that surfaced, the sense that the boundaries of his role were becoming less clear. The risk, if there was one, felt abstract. Everything he was being asked to do had precedent. There were templates. Previous examples. Existing signatures from others. This wasn't a new invention, just a continuation. He reviewed documents that had already been reviewed. He signed off on actions that had already been initiated. His signature felt like punctuation, not authorship. A period at the end of a sentence someone else had written. There was also reassurance in numbers. He was not alone in this role. Others had done similar things before. Some still were. It wasn't framed as exceptional, just situational. If this were dangerous, he reasoned, it wouldn't be so normalized. That logic was comforting. He noticed that the pace picked up slightly. Deadlines tightened. There was more urgency, though still no panic. Language shifted from, "when you can," to, "we'll need this by end of day." But urgency alone does not signal danger. In his experience, it was simply how organizations functioned under pressure. And pressure was constant. Occasionally, he encountered something that didn't fully make sense. A discrepancy. A missing attachment. A step that seemed to have been skipped. Each time, there was an explanation. That's handled elsewhere. That's legacy data. That was approved verbally. Nothing that rose to the level of refusal. And refusing would have required certainty. He didn't have certainty. What he had was plausibility. And plausibility is often enough. He adjusted. He became more efficient. He learned which inconsistencies mattered and which could be resolved retroactively. He trusted that if something were truly wrong, someone above him would intervene. That was, after all, how the system was designed. Or so it seemed. The opportunity began to feel less like a temporary assignment, and more like a position he occupied by default. Not officially, but functionally. No one clarified when it would end. No one redefined the scope. The work simply continued. He told himself this was fine. That ambiguity was normal. That clarity would come later. And because nothing bad happened, not immediately, that belief hardened. This was the most dangerous phase. Not the moment of decision. Not the first signature. But the period where repetition dulls awareness. Where actions become routine before they are fully understood. He stopped feeling like he was stepping into something new. He felt like he was maintaining something existing. A caretaker, not a creator. And because of that, he never paused to ask the question that might have changed everything. What happens if this fails? Not will it fail. Just if. That question felt unnecessary. Almost paranoid. After all, nothing had failed so far. The opportunity continued to present itself as stability. As control. As order. A way to prevent chaos. He believed he was standing at the edge, keeping things from tipping over. What he didn't see was that he had already stepped inside. And once inside, the system would begin to rely on him, not as a helper, but as a point of responsibility. Quietly. Incrementally. Without announcement. The exit was still technically there. But it was becoming harder to see. The first real decision did not announce itself as such. There was no moment where he sat back, weighed options, and consciously chose a path. If you had asked him later when he decided to cross a line, he wouldn't have been able to answer, because from his perspective, no line had been visible. What arrived instead was a situation that required resolution. A file stalled. A deadline approaching. A missing confirmation that should have come from somewhere else but hadn't. These things happen all the time. Normally, the process would have paused. An email would be sent. A request logged. Time would pass. Responsibility would diffuse. But this time, pausing carried consequences. There were downstream effects. Other departments waiting. External timelines already communicated. Delays that would create attention, and attention was the one thing everyone wanted to avoid. He noticed this not because anyone told him explicitly, but because of tone. Messages became shorter. Responses quicker. Courtesy dropped slightly, replaced by efficiency. No one said this is on you. But no one else moved either. And in that stillness, the problem subtly repositioned itself. If he did nothing, the issue would remain unresolved, and unresolved issues eventually acquire owners. If he acted, things would move forward. This framing mattered. Doing nothing would not be neutral. It would be a choice, one that created friction. Acting, on the other hand, felt like alignment. Cooperation. Professionalism. He reviewed the materials again. The missing element was not information he didn't understand. It was a confirmation that, in practice, had already been assumed. The work had been done. The outcome was functionally decided. The confirmation existed more as ritual than substance. This was important. He wasn't being asked to invent reality. Only to acknowledge it. At least, that's how it felt. He considered escalating the issue. Asking for guidance. Formally documenting the delay. But escalation had a cost. It would expose the gap. It would slow things down. It would signal that the system wasn't working smoothly. And he had been positioned, implicitly, as someone who kept things smooth. There was also the matter of precedent. Others had handled similar situations before. He had seen signatures where documentation had been completed retroactively. He had watched issues get resolved not by reopening the past, but by aligning the present with what had already happened. This was not an anomaly. It was practice. So the decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a correction. He signed. Not impulsively. Not carelessly. He took time. He reviewed what was there. He ensured the details matched existing records. He made sure nothing overtly false appeared on the page. In his mind, this was not deception. It was completion. A way of closing a loop that should have been closed earlier. The relief was immediate and subtle. The process moved forward. Messages resumed normal tone. The system exhaled. No alarms. No reprimands. No consequences. If anything, there was a quiet sense of approval, not expressed, but felt. A confirmation that he had handled the situation correctly. This feedback loop mattered more than he realized. Because it rewrote the meaning of the act. The signature was no longer just a formality. It was proof of judgment. He had demonstrated that he could be trusted to resolve ambiguity. And trust, once granted, changes expectations. Soon, similar situations appeared. Not identical, but familiar. A clarification that could be interpreted flexibly. A missing step that everyone assumed had occurred. A discrepancy that would take weeks to untangle but seconds to resolve. Each time, the decision felt easier. Not because he cared less, but because the system responded positively. Nothing broke. Nothing surfaced. Nothing came back to him. The absence of negative feedback was interpreted as validation. And so the internal calculus shifted. What once felt like an exception began to feel like discretion. He wasn't bypassing rules, he told himself. He was interpreting them. Applying them in context. Acting in good faith. That phrase mattered, good faith. It allowed him to reconcile his actions with his self-image. He still saw himself as cautious. As ethical. As someone who followed the rules, just not rigidly. Rigid people caused problems. Flexible people solved them. That was the lesson he was learning. At no point did he feel like he was taking on personal risk. Because risk, in his understanding, came from visibility. And nothing he was doing was visible. Everything was internal. Documented. Aligned with outcomes already accepted. The system absorbed his decisions seamlessly. Which meant it also absorbed his responsibility, invisibly. This was the true pivot, though it didn't feel like one. The moment where he stopped being a participant and became a stabilizer. Where his role shifted from executing steps to smoothing over gaps. And because those gaps existed everywhere, his value increased. More files came his way. More situations that required judgment. Always framed as temporary. Always framed as reasonable. No one said, "We rely on you now." They didn't need to. Reliance expresses itself through absence. Others stopped intervening. Questions stopped being asked. Decisions quietly pulled around him. If he had stepped back at that moment, if he had refused the second or third time, the pattern might have broken. But by then, refusing felt disproportionate. Why escalate now? When it had worked before? Why create friction over something so minor? The system had already incorporated his flexibility as a feature. And features, once depended upon, become expectations. This is how the first decision becomes precedent. Not because it was dramatic, but because it redefined what was normal. He still believed things were under control. He believed he was preventing problems, not creating them. He believed that if something truly serious arose, he would recognize it. That belief was sincere. And it was wrong. Because serious problems rarely announce themselves as such. They arrive as patterns. As accumulation. As repetition without reflection. By the time the stakes become visible, the behavior is already ingrained. The first decision had not locked any doors. But it had changed the direction of travel. And from that point on, every subsequent step would feel shorter, easier, more justified than the last. Not because the risks were shrinking, but because his distance from the starting point was growing. Escalation rarely feels like acceleration from the inside. From his position, nothing suddenly sped up. There was no sharp increase in pressure, no dramatic expansion of authority, no moment where he felt overwhelmed. What changed instead was density, the number of small decisions packed into each day, each one individually insignificant, collectively transformative. The work kept arriving. Not in waves. In droplets. A file here. A clarification there. A request phrased as a favor rather than a directive. Each one carried the same subtext, "You know how to handle this." And because he usually did, the system responded by giving him more opportunities to prove it. He noticed that his inbox began to differ subtly from others. He was copied earlier. Included more often. Asked privately rather than through official channels. These weren't promotions. They weren't formal acknowledgments. They were signs of informal trust, the most dangerous kind, because it is undocumented. Informal trust leaves no paper trail. But it concentrates responsibility. He did not seek this position. He drifted into it. And drifting felt safe. When questions arose, they were framed narrowly. Can you confirm this aligns with prior approvals? Does this look consistent with previous cases? Is this something we've already cleared before? These questions didn't ask him to decide outcomes. They asked him to affirm continuity. He was not creating new facts. He was preserving existing narratives. That distinction continued to shield his conscience. He still believed in escalation, in theory. If something truly abnormal appeared, he would raise it. But abnormality is subjective, and repetition erodes sensitivity. What once stood out began to blend in. Minor discrepancies stopped registering as warnings and started registering as background noise. He became adept at resolving them quickly, efficiently, without emotional engagement. Efficiency became its own justification. Time mattered. Flow mattered. Interruptions were problems. And because the system rewarded speed, speed began to feel virtuous. There was also a subtle shift in how others spoke to him. Less instruction. More assumption. They didn't explain context anymore. They trusted that he already knew it, or could infer it. That trust reduced friction, but it also removed safeguards. Context is where doubt lives. Without it, action becomes easier. When he did encounter something that made him pause, a pattern that felt slightly off, a repetition that shouldn't have been repeating, he told himself he was overthinking. Overthinking was inefficient. And inefficiency was a liability. The system did not explicitly punish caution. It simply made it uncomfortable. Delays attracted attention. Questions created meetings. Meetings created visibility. Visibility created risk. So he learned to resolve things quietly. He began to rely on his internal sense of what was acceptable. This sense was not fixed, it adjusted with exposure. Each resolved issue widened the boundaries slightly. Not enough to notice. Enough to matter. He was not alone in this. Others operated similarly. The difference was that his name appeared more often at critical junctions. His role, though unofficial, had become connective. He was a hinge. When something needed to move smoothly from one department to another, it passed through him. When a discrepancy needed to be absorbed, he absorbed it. When ambiguity threatened to slow progress, he clarified it, often by deciding it didn't matter. None of this felt malicious. It felt like stewardship. He took pride in being the person who prevented problems rather than creating them. Who understood the system deeply enough to navigate it without tripping alarms. He told himself that rigid adherence to rules often caused more harm than flexible interpretation. That real-world complexity required judgment, not dogma. And in many cases that was true. But the danger lay in extrapolation. Because once judgment becomes routine, it stops feeling like judgment. It becomes habit. He stopped documenting his reasoning as thoroughly. Not because he was hiding anything, but because the reasoning itself had become automatic. This is fine. We've seen this before. This won't matter. These thoughts replaced formal analysis. At the same time, the system began to rely on outcomes rather than process. As long as deliverables were met, questions diminished. Success masked risk. Nothing failed. Nothing triggered review. Nothing drew outside scrutiny. This absence of consequence reinforced the pattern. The escalation was quiet because it didn't add anything new, it removed friction. Checks softened. Reviews shortened. Assumptions filled gaps. And he was the one making those assumptions official. There were moments, brief, uncomfortable ones, when he felt the weight of this. Late evenings when he reviewed something twice instead of once. When he considered sending an email just to confirm. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. More often than not, he didn't. Because he had learned that nothing happened when he resolved things himself. And something always happened when he escalated. He was not rewarded for caution. He was rewarded for closure. Gradually, others stopped positioning themselves as decision-makers in these situations. They deferred to him, subtly, politely, without acknowledging what they were doing. If you're okay with it, we'll proceed. Let me know if this works on your end. The language mattered. Approval flowed through him now. And with it, exposure. Yet he still did not feel powerful. Power implies choice. He felt responsible, which is different. Responsibility narrows perspective. It focuses attention on immediate outcomes, not systemic implications. He was solving today's problem. Tomorrow could wait. He did not see the accumulation. He did not see how many small exceptions were stacking on top of one another, forming a structure that looked stable but had never been designed. He did not see how dependent the system had become on his continued flexibility. And because the system never paused to recalibrate, either did he. This phase lasted longer than he would later remember. Months blurred together. Tasks repeated with slight variations. Nothing marked the passage of time except increasing familiarity. By the time something finally felt different, not wrong, but heavier, he was already too embedded to step back without consequence. Stepping back would raise questions. Questions would uncover patterns. Patterns would demand explanation. And explanations require clarity. Clarity was now impossible. Because he could no longer remember where the line had originally been. The quiet escalation had done its work. Not by forcing him forward, but by making every step feel like standing still. The breaking point did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with paperwork. A notice. A request for records. A tone that was different, not urgent, not hostile, just formal. That was the first sign. Formal language means something has left the internal system. Someone, somewhere, had started asking questions that were no longer contained by routine. Questions that required answers not just for continuity, but for accountability. At first, the request seemed manageable. A limited scope. A defined time frame. Standard procedure, he was told. Nothing unusual. These things happened occasionally. He complied. He gathered documents. He provided explanations. Everything he submitted was accurate, in the narrow sense. The files reflected what had been done. The signatures were real. The processes were documented. There was no fabrication. But there was context missing. And context, once omitted, cannot be reinserted easily. As the review continued, the questions became more specific. Why was this approved here? Who confirmed this step? On what basis was this determination made? He answered calmly. Professionally. He explained the workflow as he understood it. He referenced precedent. He cited internal norms. The responses were acknowledged. But the questions did not stop. They multiplied. The scope widened. The timeline extended. Additional records were requested. This was when he noticed the shift. People who had once been casually involved were now distant. Conversations that used to happen informally were redirected to email. Verbal assurances disappeared. Everything was being documented. That documentation did not include tone, or intent, or habit, only names. And his name appeared frequently. Not because he had acted alone, but because he had acted consistently. Consistency creates patterns. Patterns attract attention. He began to feel exposed, not accused, but isolated. When he reached out for clarification, the responses were careful. Non-committal. Everyone was. Cooperating fully. Everyone was. Reviewing internally. No one said you're fine. No one said this was standard. No one said anything definitive. That silence mattered. Because systems protect themselves by narrowing narratives. Complexity is dangerous under scrutiny. Simplicity is safer. And the simplest narrative was this: a series of approvals. A single name recurring. A clear chain of responsibility. He did not yet understand that he had become the cleanest explanation. When the first formal interview request arrived, it still didn't feel like an ending. It felt like clarification. He prepared carefully. Reviewed records. Reconstructed timelines. He told the truth as he understood it, not defensively, not evasively. He emphasized process. Norms. The absence of objections at the time. He spoke calmly. The questions were calm too. But they did not ask about why the system functioned this way. They asked about who did what. That distinction closed the door. Because once responsibility is framed as individual action, systems fade into background noise. He was asked whether he understood the implications of his approvals. He answered honestly. He understood them within the context he had at the time. That answer did not land the way he expected. Understanding, in hindsight, had been redefined. The standard was no longer what was reasonable then. It was what could be argued now. At some point, he would later struggle to pinpoint exactly when, the tone shifted again. Not in words. In posture. The questions slowed. The interviewer took more notes. Clarifications were repeated. This was no longer information gathering. It was alignment. By the time he realized this, the structure was already fixed. His actions were being interpreted not as part of a system, but as deviations within it. His flexibility was reframed as discretion. His discretion reframed as authority. Authority, without title, is suspicious. He tried to explain that he had never been instructed to stop. That no one had raised concerns. That the work had been accepted repeatedly. That explanation required other people to confirm it. They did not. Not explicitly. Not publicly. No one contradicted him. But no one corroborated him either. The system did not turn against him. It simply stepped back. And that step back was final. Because once a system removes itself from proximity, it becomes abstract, and abstraction cannot be questioned. He was still employed. Still paid. Still waiting. That waiting was the worst part. No resolution. No accusation. No reassurance. Just time passing under uncertainty. Then came the notice. Administrative. Neutral. Carefully worded. Pending review. Temporary suspension of authority. Access limitations. Not punishment. Not yet. But something irreversible had happened. He was no longer part of the system's functioning. He was now an object of its evaluation. That is the point of no return. Not when wrongdoing is declared, but when participation ends. From that moment on, every action he had taken would be reinterpreted without the benefit of context. Every decision would be isolated, examined, stripped of its environment. The system that had once relied on him now required distance from him. Distance creates clarity. Clarity creates judgment. He was advised to seek counsel. The language was polite. Almost kind. But the implication was unmistakable. This was no longer internal. And once something leaves the system that created it, it does not return unchanged. The doors did not slam shut. They closed quietly. And when he turned around to retrace his steps, he found that the path behind him was no longer visible. Not because it had vanished, but because it had never been marked. The first consequences were not dramatic. They were procedural. Access revoked. Meetings cancelled. Emails unanswered. His calendar, once crowded with routine check-ins and quiet consultations, emptied almost overnight. Systems he had logged into daily now returned error messages. Doors that had opened automatically required authorization he no longer had. No announcement explained this shift. No meeting framed it. The change was simply enacted. He was still technically employed, but functionally absent. This limbo created a particular kind of shock, one without an event to process. There was no confrontation to replay, no sentence to argue against. Just a growing awareness that his presence had become inconvenient. At work, colleagues were polite but distant. Conversations shortened. Casual updates disappeared. When he reached out, responses arrived hours later, carefully worded, offering no information beyond what was strictly necessary. No one said, "I can't talk about this." They just didn't talk. The isolation was immediate. At home, the effects surfaced differently. Sleep became fragmented. He woke up early, heart racing, replaying interviews in his head. He began to doubt memories he had once been confident about. Had that approval really been implied? Had that step actually been standard? Certainty eroded first. Then appetite. Then concentration. He found himself staring at documents without reading them. Watching the same news segment repeat without registering content. Time slowed, but only in the moments where he was alone with his thoughts. Financial anxiety followed. His income hadn't stopped yet, but the future had become opaque. He began calculating how long he could last without a paycheck. Rent. Utilities. Savings that once felt adequate now felt fragile. He cancelled subscriptions. Deferred small purchases. These acts were not necessary yet, but they gave him a sense of control. Control was becoming scarce. Family noticed something was wrong before he explained it. Phone calls grew quieter. He avoided details. He said there was a review. An audit. Nothing serious, at least, not yet. They believed him. Or wanted to. But their concern added pressure. He felt responsible not just for outcomes, but for managing perception. He didn't want to alarm them prematurely. He didn't want to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. So he minimized. That minimization isolated him further. Friends drifted. Not intentionally. He stopped responding quickly. He declined invitations. Conversations felt exhausting. Every question carried the risk of explanation. "How's work?" became a threat. He learned to deflect. To change subjects. To smile without committing. The legal process advanced slowly, but each step carried weight. Requests for clarification. Follow-up interviews. Formal letters. Each document arrived with neutral language and heavy implication. Nothing accused him directly. Everything suggested exposure. He hired counsel. That decision, once made, changed the emotional texture of everything. Conversations became strategic. Words were chosen carefully. Silence gained value. He was advised not to discuss details with anyone. Not to speculate. Not to volunteer information. This advice made sense. It also deepened the sense of isolation. He was now living inside a narrative he could not share. The shock intensified when he realized how differently his past actions were being framed. Things that had once been routine were now labeled discretionary. Decisions that had been collaborative were now described as unilateral. Absences of objection were reframed as implicit endorsement. He read summaries of his own work that felt unfamiliar. Not false, but incomplete. And incompleteness can be as damaging as fabrication. Emotionally, he oscillated. Some days he felt calm, almost detached. He told himself that truth would clarify things. That once the full picture was seen, the logic would be obvious. Other days, panic took over. He imagined worst-case scenarios. Professional ruin. Public exposure. Legal consequences he had never considered possible. The mind fills uncertainty with extremes. He began to notice physical symptoms. Tightness in the chest. Shallow breathing. A persistent tension in his jaw. Small noises startled him. Notifications triggered adrenaline. He checked his phone compulsively, then avoided it entirely. Short-term consequences are cruel because they lack resolution. Nothing had ended. Nothing had been decided. Yet everything had changed. He was no longer who he had been, but not yet who he would become. The world continued as usual around him. Trains ran. Offices opened. Colleagues moved on to new projects. But he remained suspended, defined by a question mark. The most destabilizing realization came quietly. The system he had trusted to be rational was now behaving exactly as designed. Protecting itself. Reducing complexity. Minimizing liability. And he, unintentionally, represented all three. This wasn't personal. That fact did not make it easier. In the short term, there was no dramatic collapse, only erosion. Of confidence. Of identity. Of belonging. The immediate damage was not public. It was internal. And it was only the beginning. The long-term consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded the way rust spreads, slowly, quietly, until the structure beneath could no longer bear weight. Time passed, but it did not heal. It clarified. The review became an investigation. The investigation became a case. Language shifted again, this time unmistakably. Where there had once been process questions, there were now findings. Where there had been context, there were now determinations. Words hardened. Options narrowed. His employment ended without ceremony. No accusation in the announcement. No acknowledgement of service. Just a termination letter that framed the decision as administrative necessity. The building he had walked into for years was no longer accessible. His badge deactivated. His email erased. His digital footprint scrubbed to the extent policy allowed. He became someone who used to work there. That phrase carried no explanation, and no defense. Finding new work proved harder than he expected. His experience was real. His skills intact. But references were cautious. Titles vague. Gaps unexplained. Background checks asked questions that could not be answered cleanly. Are you currently under investigation? Have you ever been disciplined for compliance issues? Truth required nuance. Forms did not allow nuance. He learned quickly that honesty without framing was dangerous, and framing without proof was suspect. Each application became a negotiation between disclosure and survival. Interviews went well until they didn't. Smiles tightened. Timelines stretched. Follow-ups never came. He was not rejected explicitly. He was filtered out. Professionally, his trajectory flattened. Roles he would once have dismissed now felt aspirational. Temporary contracts replaced stable positions. Consulting replaced employment. Benefits disappeared. Income became inconsistent. Savings drained more slowly than he feared, but steadily enough to remain visible. He adjusted again: cheaper housing, fewer choices, smaller margins. The psychological toll compounded. Uncertainty turned into vigilance. He scanned news feeds for keywords related to his case. He read legal updates obsessively, searching for signs of movement. Every delay felt ominous. Years passed differently under stress. Milestones blur. Seasons repeat. He marked time not by holidays or achievements, but by procedural events, filings, hearings, responses. Relationships suffered. Some people stayed, but they learned not to ask. Others drifted away under the weight of prolonged ambiguity. Invitations stopped coming. Life events happened without him. Not out of cruelty. Out of discomfort. People don't know how to live alongside unresolved stories. Romantic relationships proved especially fragile. Explaining his situation required trust. Trust required stability. Stability was precisely what he lacked. He became cautious. Guarded. Afraid of burdening others with a narrative that had no end date. Loneliness set in, not acute, but chronic. The kind that doesn't hurt sharply, but dulls everything. His sense of identity eroded further. He had once defined himself through competence. Through being useful. Through fitting into a structure larger than himself. Now, that structure had rejected him. And without it, he struggled to articulate who he was. He was not innocent in a way that felt exonerating. But he was not guilty in a way that felt explanatory either. He occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. One that offers no language. The case eventually reached a point where facts were no longer being discovered, only interpreted. That phase was the most draining. Because interpretation is where intention is assigned. And intention, once attributed, sticks. He watched as his actions were frozen in time, stripped of sequence and context. Decisions were isolated. Fragments examined. Patterns drawn backward. What had once been ambiguity became narrative. Not a dramatic one. A plausible one. And plausible narratives are the hardest to dislodge. The long-term consequence was not just outcome, it was redefinition. He was now someone whose past could be summarized without him present. Someone whose name carried an asterisk. Someone who had learned, too late, that systems remember selectively. As years passed, the acute fears softened into something heavier. Resignation. He stopped expecting resolution. He learned to live inside limitation. To plan short-term. To avoid imagining futures that depended on institutional trust. He became smaller in his ambitions. Not because he wanted to. Because he had to. The most enduring loss was not financial or professional. It was temporal. He lost the ability to think forward without calculation, to imagine growth without caveats, to see time as expansive rather than something to endure. Long-term consequences don't announce themselves. They normalize. And by the time they feel familiar, they have already reshaped the person living inside them. The truth did not emerge as a revelation. It emerged as a file. A thick, structured record compiled over time by people who had never met him in the context he remembered himself. It did not describe a life. It described a sequence. Dates. Actions. Approvals. Outcomes. The file was orderly. Logical. Persuasive. And it told a story that was not entirely wrong, which made it dangerous. By the time the hearing approached, most of the work had already been done. The questions were no longer exploratory. They were confirmatory. The narrative had been drafted. The process now existed to validate it. He read the file slowly. Not because it was complex, but because it felt unfamiliar. He recognized the documents. He recognized the signatures. He recognized the language. What he did not recognize was himself. The file described a figure with intent, coherence, and continuity of control. Someone whose actions flowed logically from one decision to the next. Someone who managed outcomes. That was not how it had felt at the time. But feeling does not survive documentation. There were sections devoted to decision points, moments where discretion was inferred, gaps where silence was interpreted as consent. The file did not lie. It selected. It selected moments that could be framed clearly. It excluded moments that depended on atmosphere, urgency, assumption. It favored what could be proven over what had been normal. This was the nature of the truth now. The hearing itself was restrained. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontations. Just a room. A panel. Questions asked with professional neutrality. He answered carefully. Truthfully. With awareness that every word could be repurposed. He explained context. He described norms. He spoke about expectations that were never written down. These explanations were acknowledged. They were not integrated. Because systems do not absorb context easily once conclusions have momentum. At several points, he realized something unsettling. The hearing was not primarily about understanding what happened. It was about establishing that something had happened, and that it could be attributed. The institution presented its findings. Not as accusation, but as conclusion. They spoke of risk exposure. Of governance failures. Of delegated authority exceeding scope. He listened as language transformed his past into abstract principle. When his counsel responded, the arguments were precise, careful, limited. They did not attempt to rewrite the story. They attempted to soften its edges. Because rewriting would require admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty was what the system needed to eliminate. There was no verdict in the cinematic sense. Just outcomes. Sanctions. Restrictions. Professional consequences. Not maximal. Not minimal. Proportionate. That word appeared repeatedly. Proportionate to the findings. Proportionate to precedent. Proportionate to risk. Proportion did not refer to impact on his life. It referred to internal consistency. When it was over, there was no sense of finality. No catharsis. No clarity. Only a formal acknowledgement that the process had concluded. He walked out of the room unchanged in appearance, but altered in status. The truth, as defined by the file, would now travel without him. Media coverage, where it existed, was limited and factual. Headlines used passive language. No villains. No heroes. Just compliance issues. Just governance lapses. The absence of spectacle made it heavier. There was nothing to push back against. Nothing exaggerated enough to dispute. The most painful realization came later, quietly. The file had not been designed to understand him. It had been designed to protect the system from repetition. And in that purpose, it had succeeded. Whatever truth he carried about intention, about pressure, about normalization, it no longer mattered. The record was complete. And completeness, in institutional terms, is the closest thing to truth that exists. After the case concluded, the system moved quickly, not to reflect, but to adjust. There were memos, policy updates, training modules released with neutral titles like lessons learned and enhanced oversight frameworks. Nothing referenced him by name. From the outside, it looked like progress. New approval thresholds were introduced. Dual signature requirements added. Language around discretion tightened. Words like judgment were replaced with escalation protocols. On paper, accountability increased. In practice, responsibility diffused further. The system did not admit failure. It reframed risk. The narrative became one of improvement rather than correction. The organization presented itself as responsive, proactive, mature. And in doing so, it quietly severed the story from the person at its center. Internally, people adjusted behavior. Not toward ethics. Toward safety. Questions were asked more often, but only in writing. Decisions were escalated, but selectively. Documentation expanded, not to capture reality, but to create insulation. The lesson absorbed was not understand the system better. It was don't be the one whose name appears too often. His case became a reference point without detail. A cautionary example stripped of context. You don't want to end up like that. That's how people get caught in reviews. No one discussed how normalized the behavior had been. No one discussed how many others had operated similarly. The system had no incentive to surface those truths. Because doing so would implicate design, not deviation. Instead, the adjustments focused on optics. New committees formed. Oversight roles created. Checklists expanded. Each edition created more steps, more signatures, more abstraction. The system grew heavier. And heavier systems require more intermediaries. People like him. Except now, they were more careful. More hesitant. More protective. They learned to leave traces that pointed upward, sideways, anywhere but inward. Authority continued to flow down. Risk continued to flow up. But blame, when necessary, flowed toward whoever stood closest to the traceable decision. Nothing fundamental changed. The incentives remained. Speed still mattered. Outcomes still mattered. Continuity still mattered. Only now, the choreography was more complex. Externally, regulators cited the case as evidence of enforcement, of vigilance, of deterrence. They did not ask whether deterrence applied to systems or individuals. They rarely do. Other organizations took note. Some implemented similar changes. Others quietly reassured themselves that their structures were different enough. Everyone believed they would recognize the warning signs earlier. Everyone believes that. But warning signs are visible only in retrospect, and only to those who survive intact. He watched this from a distance. Occasionally, someone would reach out quietly. Former colleagues. Acquaintances in adjacent fields. They asked cautious questions. What was it really like? Could it happen to anyone? He answered carefully. Not because he feared consequences anymore, those had already landed, but because he understood how fragile narratives were. He did not want to become a parable. Parables flatten complexity. He knew that systems do not learn from individual stories. They learn from data, from trends, from repetition. And his case, singular and contained, was easy to compartmentalize. It became a footnote in compliance training. A bullet point in risk assessments. Not a mirror. The system survived. It always does. That is not evidence of correctness. It is evidence of resilience. And resilience often depends on sacrifice, though the system rarely names it as such. From the outside, it looked as though balance had been restored. Inside, the same tensions remained. People still navigated ambiguity. Still filled gaps. Still made assumptions to keep things moving. They simply did so with more distance. More layers. More plausible deniability. The system did not ask whether it had placed unreasonable burdens on individuals operating within it. It asked how to ensure those individuals were easier to separate next time. That was the quiet outcome. No villain removed. No structure dismantled. Just a recalibration that ensured continuity. And in that recalibration, the person at the center of the story disappeared completely. Not erased. Replaced. In the years that followed, his life did not collapse. It narrowed. He found work again, not prestigious, not visible, but sufficient. Roles with limited exposure. Contracts with defined boundaries. Environments where discretion was minimized and responsibility was explicit. He chose them deliberately. Not because he had lost confidence in his ability, but because he had learned what ambiguity could cost. His days became quieter. Predictable. Contained. There were no new milestones worth announcing. No professional ladder to climb. No narrative of redemption that fit neatly into conversation. When people asked what he did now, he answered simply. And when they asked what had happened, he offered even less. Not out of shame. Out of fatigue. The story took too long to explain, and explaining it rarely changed anything. Sometimes, late at night, he replayed the earlier years, not the hearing, not the aftermath, but the moments before everything hardened into record. The emails. The approvals. The signatures that had felt weightless at the time. He tried to identify the precise moment when a different choice would have changed the outcome. He never found one. Because the truth was unsettling, there was no single wrong decision. There was only accumulation. And accumulation does not feel like error while it is happening. It feels like normalcy. That realization followed him more persistently than the sanctions ever had. He became attentive in ways he hadn't been before. To phrasing. To assumptions. To the quiet ways responsibility moves through systems without being named. He noticed how often people confused compliance with safety. How often, approved, was treated as synonymous with right. He did not correct them. He had learned what happens to people who disrupt narratives without power. So he listened. He watched. And he kept his distance. From the outside, his life looked smaller. From the inside, it felt clearer. Not better. Clearer. The echoes of the story appeared unexpectedly. In news articles about similar cases. In policy changes announced elsewhere. In conversations that used words like oversight and governance without specifying what those words demanded of individuals. Each time, he felt a familiar tension, recognition without identification. He was no longer part of those systems. But he understood them more intimately than most. The final consequence was not bitterness. It was skepticism. A quiet, durable skepticism toward structures that promise protection while distributing risk invisibly. Toward narratives that assign responsibility without tracing incentives. Toward the idea that good faith is sufficient defense. He did not become cynical in the loud sense. He became cautious in the private one. If there was a question left unanswered by his story, it was this: at what point does ordinary participation become liability? Not in theory. In practice. When does doing what makes sense locally create harm globally? And how many people are carrying signatures they don't yet recognize as defining? The system moved on. It always does. New names filled old roles. New procedures replaced old ones. The machinery continued, refined but unchanged in spirit. He existed outside it now. Not free. Not trapped. Just aware. And that awareness was not a gift he could pass on easily. Because awareness without authority is silent. The story does not end with a lesson. It ends with a question that remains unspoken in most institutions. Who is actually protected when everything is working as designed? And who is simply next?